Okay, this video is communication levels, styles, theories, and philosophies. So levels refers to as you move from being a stranger towards becoming a friend. Styles is a little bit of the different ways that people will choose to handle situations and why. Theories is sort of like what's the overarching, what's behind it, okay? And philosophies is you can literally choose how you want to approach certain types of communication, which from my point of view will be a lecture style. Okay, so we'll go through all this pretty quick. Claude Shannon was this genius guy who came up with methods of transmitting communication over long distance electronic systems, like let's say for telegrams and whatnot. And he was especially interested in how does one reduce noise in long distance communication, like let's say a long distance telephone. And so that's a simple conduit. You send a message over a wire, and then the recipient decodes the message and receives it, and it's a very simple thing, just the text itself, if you will, the conduit metaphor. Stranger uncertainty reduction theory of Berger and Calabrese has to refer to, when you talk to somebody who you don't know, you want to keep it real simple and predictable, especially if there's emotional tension or anything. And that's also transactional conversation. You buy something at a store. Thank you. I would like that. Thank you very much. You want to keep everything predictable, monotone, under control, so the stranger can understand you. Somebody who might have a very different culture, background, or way of looking at things than you. So that's how you keep that under control. And the next step up would be a cooperative conversation, let's say with a colleague, a peer, and these are called Grice's maxims. So what Grice was talking about, he has 4 maxims of communication. A decent cooperative conversation is you both agree we're going to try to tell the truth here. We're going to stick to the topic at hand, keep it relevant. We're going to try to be clear and simple and brief. And that's a cooperative conversation with a colleague, a functional conversation. And that could even be, again, almost with a stranger. You go to a store, they explain to you what product has, pros and cons of it. But you're going into Grice's maxims. And you'll see yourself passing through these phases if you start out talking to a stranger and you gradually have to talk to them for a prolonged amount of time. With friends, it's different. You don't have to worry about staying on a predictable path. With your friend, you can pull in things from all over. You can have multiple simultaneous threads, and that's partly why it's a lot of fun to talk to friends. And you're partly informing each other. You're partly also trying to entertain each other. It's playful, extroverted, gregarious. Okay, and we've talked about Aristotle a little bit with regard to conversation, but Aristotle was especially big with regard to logic in what is called the rational world paradigm. And the rational world paradigm was 2 free men in Athens, 2 aristocratic Athenians who were educated, having a logical conversation about something they both cared about. And Aristotle would say, the better informed expert is more likely to win the argument because he will come up with superior reasons, evidence, and logic to support his claims. Okay, but then these later rhetoricians came along, and Kenneth Burke and Chaim Perlman, and they said, no, it's not that simple because lots of times the audiences and the speakers are quite different from each other. Aristotle had assumed a tremendous amount of common ground, which was the case with 2 male aristocrats from Athens, but not necessarily in most modern situations. And they felt that what Aristotle meant as absolute truth was more like the absolute truth from the perspective of men who shared values. Therefore, any speaker with a new audience needs to find a common ground. Okay? Another communications expert named Walter Fisher came along and he said, logic's smogic in the sense of that's not really how most arguments are settled. He said that many arguments are settled by just comparing the stories and then the reasons for the stories as well as the emotions. And the emotions quite often are more important than the logic. And Walter called this the storyteller comparison or the narrative paradigm. And everybody's seen this in their own family, with your wife or something. You could be totally right, but if she generates more emotional or shifts the blame for something on you, a lot of times she'll win the argument no matter what was the underlying truth or whatever of it. And so, like I said, there's some places where rational paradigm works better, somewhere narrative paradigm works better. And being aware of them, the more you're aware of the nuance of a conversation, the more chance you have to make it go your way or to at least be clear about it. Carl Rogers, a psychologist, he did some good stuff. I mean, he had his school of psychology one time called unconditional positive regard for the patient client. And I thought that was a step up because a lot of the Freudian stuff and then the Freudian protege stuff, there was a little bit of a tendency to label the patient with some insulting label, almost degrading them. And Thomas Szasz had talked about this. Thomas Szasz had said how wrong he felt that was, the idea of degrading the patient with a derogatory label. And he wrote a book called The Myth of Psychotherapy. Okay, and Thomas Szasz went too far in the other direction, but Thomas Szasz was a brilliant guy as well. Okay, and Eisnick was also a fascinating guy. Okay, so anyways, what did Carl Rogers say? What Carl Rogers said was, first of all, you have to have the person, the patient, the client, call him a client instead of a patient. Client's a little bit less derogatory perhaps than patient in the context of discussing mental illness. And, and Szasz would say, what do you mean mental illness? These are people with problems. Everybody has problems. Sometimes they're sad. Call them sad rather than call them depressed. Call them, anxious, rather than labeling them necessarily with a specific disorder. So Carl Rogers said, what he's saying in a sense is, you need to first establish sort of a bit of a friendship, if you will, where the person can feel comfortable talking to you. And I would describe it as you're letting them go into a parasympathetic autonomic nervous system rather than sympathetic. Those are the seesaw. Sympathetic is stressed out. Parasympathetic is relaxed. Sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is feed and breed, rest and digest. Okay? So, Carl Rogers goes on. He says, you have to be orientated properly to have a useful conversation. The goal is to help each other, to listen carefully, to tell the truth, to cheer each other. Empathic, attentive listening with the goal of making things better. And Carl Rogers goes on beyond this. When I can relax and be close to the transcendental core of me, I may behave in strange and impulsive ways, which I cannot justify rationally, that have nothing to do with my thought process, but these strange behaviors turn out to be right in some odd way. At these moments, it seems as if my inner spirit has reached out and touched the inner spirit of another. Our relationship transcends itself and becomes something larger. And that's the way it is with a friend. You just sense where things are going in a conversation with your friend, and you'll throw in a joke, or you'll bring up something out of the past, or you'll do an imitation just because it's funny in the context. You just feel it. You just know it. You sense it. It's almost like your subconscious mind's a lot smarter than your conscious mind. Your conscious mind can only hold one thought at a time. Your subconscious mind holds incredible amounts of data and can come up with all kinds of things. The key is to be sensitive enough to pay attention to it. Like I said, too, Beethoven said an artist is someone who's learned how to trust himself. And that's also a lot true of a comedian. A comedian just feels something funny and goes with it. Okay, so some of the things I liked about Carl Rogers, he said a good therapeutic conversation is the ultimate of subjectivity. And the reason that's funny is if you ever read medical literature, a lot of psychology, formal psychology literature, there's always this emphasis on standardized, be standardized. What does the scientific literature say? But that's largely BS, conversation with a friend. Your relationship with a person, that's an individual thing. It's not a standardized thing. B.F. Skinner, the guy who believes in behaviorism, that people are like mice, he wants everything standardized. But, a real person friend, it's a personal, subjective thing. Okay, Carl Rogers, actually, I don't know, this isn't Carl Rogers, this is sort of like what I was talking, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. If the person is stressed out or doesn't feel safe or comfortable, their guard's going to be up. They're in an amygdala uptight position, and they're not going to speak freely. Okay, now another thing is called social penetration theory, and this is Altman and Taylor, and they describe the person's personality as being like an onion, and you peel away the layers of the onion, so to speak, with reciprocating self-disclosures. So a person initially will only reveal superficial, trivial things that they feel safe talking about. And if the other person in the conversation seems to respond to that, they're both comfortable with it, then they'll be more free to reveal something that might even be a little more embarrassing, a little more personal, a little more unique, a little more private. And gradually, as they feel comfortable, they'll progress towards being able to speak more freely and to be more relaxed around each other. And I like the Lewis Carroll quote, "If you believe in me, I'll believe in you." Okay, and I'll get to how this works in medicine. If you see an up-and-coming young person trying to get promoted, to become a full professor and whatnot, they have to play the game for the most part and be very formal, be very deferential to their seniors. And let's say somebody's trying to get tenured as a professor, for example. On the other hand, usually junior people, their talks are not so good. Like, I don't think I've ever learned anything from a medical student talk. They just don't know enough, most of them, unless they've worked outside for a while, outside the healthcare system or at least the medical system for a while. They can bring some unique experience to it. So what I'm getting at is, if you're given a formal presentation, you kind of have to be formal, but the audiences usually don't learn much from those presentations. The best speakers are usually older speakers who have a lot of experience, and they'll tell you the truth about stuff. They'll tell you about the mistakes they made earlier in the career. Now, a young guy, he's not going to want to admit his mistakes, okay? And it has to also be somebody who's pretty comfortable in their own shoes, and they're not worried about getting in trouble for telling you the truth about their mistakes, because you will learn from that. You know, if they say, look, we thought this was one condition, we thought it was cardiac ischemia, but it turned out to be cardiac tamponade. We mismanaged the situation. Next time I'll earlier get an echocardiogram and look for a pericardial effusion, okay? That would be useful, all right? You know, when they say, look, we thought this was just chronic degenerative disc disease of the spine, and we sort of just ignored it, but it turned out to be an infection. We screwed up. Next time we'll get an early short interval follow-up MRI of the lumbar spine. That's valuable to the audience, because they'll all be in that same situation sooner or later, and they can learn from it. So if you want to be a good speaker, you have to choose how vulnerable you could be. And by that I mean, the more vulnerable you are to admitting screw-ups and mistakes you've made, maybe say someone else did it, but still talk about those things. Because there's an old saying, too, in medicine, nothing teaches better than a missed case. You learn from the mistakes. You know, it's like the Churchill quote, nothing is so firmly fixed in our memory as that which we have blundered, you know. And, one other doc said every doc has his own little graveyard of mistakes he's made in the past. And so those things, you know, when a doc sits there and they tells you about mistakes made at their institution or whatever, you learn from that. And once you hear that, you go, oh, my gosh, I was in a situation like that last week, or I know people get in those situations. You'll never make that mistake. That's why those types of lectures are so valuable. I've heard speakers talking about, head trauma cases, and they say, watch out for fractures in the occipital bone right here with a fall. We see these get missed. Boom, I see one, the next month, okay? And I had that experience a lot. Okay, so that's why a good speaker really helps the audience a lot. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about where am I at in terms of my thinking on giving talks. A couple things are, number one, you want to make the talk as visual as possible. People remember pictures much more than words, but still, jokes, metaphors, rhymes are all real helpful. But what I've noticed is most medical talks are real boring. They're quite formal, not necessarily a research talk. Not as formal as a typical doctor when they talk to a patient. They're very formal because they don't know if the patient's crazy initially. They don't know if the patient's stupid. So they're really slow, polite, and formal, at least initially. Academic talks are a little less formal than that, but they still tend to be real boring on this old school stupid, tell them what you told them, then tell them you told them, and then tell them again. And that's really pathetic, almost insulting. And so what am I getting at? Think about conversations you like, watching a comedian. They're funny. It's all jokes. You enjoy that. Think about a conversation with a friend. You laugh, and then the conversation just goes wherever it goes. It's a spontaneous thing. And if you're, lucky enough to have had good parents that were nice to you and taught you stuff, my dad used to always make me laugh. He'd always call everything, and every time I did something stupid, he'd just go, you just failed your instant IQ test. Here's an instant IQ test for you. Go do this. Go do this. And I really enjoyed being around my dad. I mean, he's working most of the time, so when he was around, that was a lot of fun. And then if you had good coaches are often pretty funny, and you learn a lot from them. You see the motivational speaker guys like Brian Tracy and Zig Ziglar and Jim Rohn, they're good. They're a little bit playing it a little safe, though, because they got this wide audience, and they're a little scared to take too many risks, but still, they're good. You learn from them. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying, and then also there's political speakers, but political speakers can say some good stuff, but they're usually liars, so it's not that great. Religious speakers, sometimes they can be good, especially the more old school they are. But again, they're usually sticking to the book perhaps too much, and especially the modern ones with the not-for-profit status. They're like intellectually castrated, and they suck. Okay, so anyways, what am I getting at? What I'm saying is for academic talks, and I give tons of academic talks, what I try to do is just say, forget this. I'm going to go to somewhere sort of in between here. How I talk with an intelligent friend and how my dad used to talk to me. Because my dad was a little more formal and serious than like my intelligent friends are. And by that way, you can be open, you can be playful, I will just assume that you'll understand what I'm saying, because if you're motivated enough to watch these types of talks, then you're obviously a pretty smart, motivated person. And therefore, I'll talk to you that way, and we can both get to the point a lot faster, and we can have a lot more fun. Versus, so you have to decide where you're going to set the main audience where are they at, where are you at, and by setting it at, I'm talking to an intelligent friend, I think everything just goes better for everybody. It's more fun for me, it's more fun for the audience, and they're the ones that want to hear what I have to say anyways. Okay, comedians all jokes. A friend is infotainment, information and jokes, entertainment. Let's see. So that was kind of my big goal, and that I've done that in speaking, and I've gotten a lot of compliments on doing that. I have also sometimes annoyed some senior formal person, but it's usually because they're jealous or mad at me because they don't like me, saying nutrition's better than pharmaceuticals. Okay, stuff like that. I'll sometimes get a little bit of a backlash from that direction, but you have anybody. The only way to not ever get any backlash or criticism is if you don't do anything. So you just have to accept it. So, anyways, that was kind of the point of this. Where this all went was my big philosophic shift on academic lectures is to make them like talking to an intelligent friend. And some people say, "Oh, you shouldn't talk about religion. You shouldn't talk about all this other stuff." And I go, "No, I'm going to talk about whatever I want. I don't care. It might not get me invited to interview places, but I think in the long run, it'll make my talks more helpful to the audience." So, anyways, that's where it's at.